Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fall. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show. Turn up your mind.
Where's he at? Where's he at? Where's he at? Where's he at? Guys, pray for us. This is crazy out here. Keep us in your prayers. They're attacking us. The communists are out. White lives matter. 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 White lives matter.
So, Tim Wise, who I invited on the show today, has written so many books about this this subject. The one that I could not put down was called "Dear White America: A Letter to a New Minority," and it talks about how in America being white meant never having to think about race. And now, all of a sudden, you have this racial identity, this radical fear that white people are going to have to consider race for the first time in their lives as it applies to them. Never to others, but to them. So, I mean, to talk about this, you need a big brain. You need a guy who's thought about this a million times. And so I invited Tim Wise. I've invited Tim Wise to come talk to us many times during this Trump dilemma. But today is the day, right, Tim? Today is the time.
Today is the day, yes, indeed.
So what do you make of all this? Do you think, as I do, that the president has been pouring gas on the crosses for a very long time? Do you think that he understands that there's a lot of insecurity in this country with regard to white 20 to 30-year-olds and that they think that brown people are their problem?
Right. Well, I don't know what Donald Trump does and doesn't understand from moment to moment. I think I'm not sure he knows what he understands from moment to moment. But I certainly think the one thing he does know and has always known is salesmanship and marketing. And during the course of the campaign, his principal way of marketing himself, as I think the listeners know, was to take advantage of racial scapegoating, the politics of prejudice, whether or not he himself personally adhered to all of those prejudicial views that he played upon. He used it. It was a marketing tool, and it worked. And now the problem is, regardless of his own heart, and I don't even pretend to judge anyone's heart, I judge their actions. Those actions have now tethered him to a white nationalist narrative, whether he likes it or not, which is one of the reasons that when David Duke shows up in Charlottesville and they ask him why he's there, David Duke has no problem talking about David Duke. But notice he didn't do that. He said, we're here to fulfill Donald Trump's agenda. And then Donald Trump, at least initially, unwilling to just come out and say, whoa, this isn't my agenda. You guys are 100% wrong. You've got it all wrong. He didn't have the fortitude or the decency to do that. And today he comes forward, 2.5 days later, and makes this statement. I think he knows that he owes his election, at least in part, to people like this. Now, I would never contend that the majority of his supporters are white nationalists. But I will say that I think it is indisputable that the difference in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, 3 states he won by a combined total of less than 70,000 votes, most certainly were dependent upon the votes of overtly racist people. Pennsylvania has the highest concentration, at least as of a couple of years ago, highest concentration of hate groups in the United States. So do I think that he, in fact, does owe his election to people like that? Absolutely, even though most of his supporters aren't Nazis and overt white supremacists. And I think he knows that. And I think he was trying to hedge a bet. Luckily, the outrage of the nation, forced him to do the right thing. But it's just sort of pathetic when the president, when you're actually applauding somebody condemning Nazis. I mean, that should be like the lowest possible floor for human decency, and it took him 2.5 days to conjure it.
Right, and this is a guy whose words mean nothing, and still he wouldn't say those words. You know, you had to wait 3 days for him to say those words, and then they dragged him pretty much kicking and screaming to that podium. He opened up this this press conference. It wasn't a press conference. This statement today with, you know, how great his economy is and how he's created 1 million jobs and how his stock market is. You know, I mean, it was really sickening. It wasn't the first thing on his mind, and it took him almost 4 minutes to get to the part where he said that includes the KKK and you know, whatever. I mean, he's obviously, listen, I believe Trump believes absolutely nothing. I think he's an empty shell of a person. I don't think he has any beliefs whatsoever either way about anything. Except himself. So, but it is, you know, like I said, it's not even a dog whistle anymore. It's out front. It's a giant trumpet. It's a brass band playing, you know, Nazi music by, you know, just putting Bannon in there and Gorka, who appears with these Hungarian Nazi medals on his chest, and Stephen Miller, you know, takes up the poem by Emma Lazarus which is a big. You know, white supremacist issue. I mean, David Duke wrote an entire book about, you know, the Emma Lazarus poem. So what is this about? I mean, how as white people do I reach out to these white people?
Right. Well, I think, you know, there's some, look, you can't save everybody. That's one thing you learn doing this work. But I think what's interesting about this moment that really nobody is commenting on, you know, during the campaign, we heard a lot about white economic anxiety and working class white people and coal miners that don't have jobs and want to blame that on hippies or whatever, and environmental regulation, or, you know, industry people that, you know, work on assembly lines that are losing their jobs to Mexicans supposedly. But interestingly, you know, these folks in Charlottesville, really, that's not who this was. These weren't coal miners. These were not like hard scrabble working class. This was not the people from Hillbilly Elegy. This was college kids and people that wear polo shirts and khakis. These are mostly solidly middle class folks. So what in the world? I mean, if this is what they do when they're still twice as likely as black folks to have a job, 1/3 is likely to be poor, 15 times the net worth in their families on average in the typical black family. Imagine what they would do if they actually faced oppression. You know, and I think the thing that we're missing in this is, like, when people say, well, why would these folks revolt? They're not even the ones who are necessarily struggling. Here's the thing. And I was thinking about this today, and I haven't had a chance to say it until now, and I haven't heard anyone else say it. Imagine for a minute that for 200 years, you have been told, and people like you have been told, and you have come to believe it because you've heard it over and over again, that the world is your oyster, that you are the one for whom the country was created. And by the way, when Richard Spencer and these Nazis and white supremacists say that, they're not wrong. You know, Richard Spencer's understanding of the founders' vision of America is actually quite a bit more accurate than many of us. Like, the founders did, in fact, intend for this to be a white male-dominated country. That doesn't mean we have to accept it, but he's certainly right about the mentality of the founding. So when you say that, and white men have been told that in a million ways, overtly, year after year, generation after generation, and then suddenly you're having to share space with women of whatever race, with people of color, with folks of different faith backgrounds, different sexual orientations, different gender identities. You know, it used to be white men were the only voice in the room. And now they're not. And if you have come to feel entitled to take up all that space when somebody says, no, actually now we got to sort of do equity, how about that? That feels like oppression to you because you're coming from a place of hegemonic control. So if I'm used to 90% to 100% and you're telling me to make do with my 62% that's white or whatever, then I'm going to think that's the end of the world. And so we have to place this revolt in the context of entitlement. And, you know, we talk about entitlements a lot in this country, and we usually use that term to refer to low-income folks who feel they're owed something. Nobody feels entitled more than white men in this country. And we saw that on display this weekend. They cannot bear the notion of sharing the country and the space. They believe and they say diversity is genocide. Apparently they believe if they don't have all of it, that their lives are over. That is incredibly fragile.
Well, that is true. I mean, when you look at them, even when you look at the Kessler guy who tried to stand up and make a speech after this horrible incident, and I mean, they just ran him out, and you could see him in the video. He's like all scrunched up and scared. He's just terrified. Because he knows.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, you're right. They are cowards. The idea that they tweet you and that they feel very strong in their pajamas, and they feel very strong in groups does not mean that they're strong-minded or that they have ideas.
Everybody's a badass. Everybody's a badass on Reddit. It doesn't really take a lot of courage. And look, they've got some street fighting. I mean, they've got some quite significantly dangerous people out there in those streets. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But yeah, we're talking about a bunch of guys who are coming out from behind the computer, putting down the video games in the Hot Pockets or whatever it is they're sitting around on their sofas eating all day, and coming out to do battle. And I don't want to downplay the danger because we saw what one of them, and the guy that is alleged to and apparently ran over and killed this woman and injured all these other folks. He didn't look like a real badass to me. When you look at him, he doesn't look like a real seriously strong, dangerous guy, but he clearly is when he's behind the wheel of a car. So even the most nebbishy-looking guy can do incredible damage when he's fueled by hate. And that's why it's incumbent upon white Americans right now to say that when Matt Heimbach, one of the organizers of this thing and one of the more notorious white nationalists, says, we are the voice for white America, it is incumbent upon those of us who are white to say, no, you're not. You don't speak for us. And so white folks have got to choose a side because these folks have declared civil war on the notion of a multicultural democracy. And so we're going to have to decide which side of that war are we on. There's no more place for neutrality. It is one or the other.
Yeah, I agree with you. And what really kills me is when the president talks about this, there's no policy. He has no policy for this, okay? He doesn't say, by the way, if you use a car and it looks like Nice, or if you use a car and it looks like, terrorism, you will be charged with terrorism. We're going to update the laws. This guy is being charged with second-degree murder. Obviously, it's premeditated.
Well, right now, they could treat these white nationalists. This was a clear intention to incite. On the first night, on Friday night, the white nationalists surrounded a peaceful group of demonstrators. It wasn't Antifa throwing stuff at them or yelling. It was a peaceful group of demonstrators on the campus. They surrounded them and refused to let them exit. Richard Spencer actually admitted that on his Twitter feed. Now, keep in mind, that's a felony. It's called unlawful imprisonment. If you surround a person and don't let them leave and exit, you are committing a crime. They were not arrested for that. So that could be a charge that was brought. And then the president and the Justice Department could say, these are terrorists.
Yes.
This organization, and as terrorists, we can freeze their bank accounts. Mm-hmm. We can freeze their individual accounts. We can freeze their collective accounts. We can take, that's what we do or we try to do with ISIS. That's what we did with Al-Qaeda or tried to do, right? So why in the world are we playing games like these are just like it's a club down the street? These are people who have announced. Richard Spencer has said he wants to create a white ethno-state in America. That is tantamount to calling for the overthrow of the government of the United States, which if I do that, I'm going to jail. If a black person in this country does that on behalf of Black Lives Matter, they're going to jail. And they're going to jail for more than just second-degree whatever or aggravated assault or intent to, incite a riot. They're going to go to jail for threatening to overthrow violently the government of the United States. So I think, these are folks who have shown themselves to be terrorists. They are willing to use weapons, in this case an automobile, to do damage. They are willing to attack people without provocation. And to act as if it's a free speech issue, to do that is absurd. To act as if it's a simple petty crime issue, to do that is absurd. It's time to freeze their bank accounts. It's time to bankrupt them. It's time to put an end to this before it gets out of hand, because it's already headed that way.
I agree with you, and that's what's killing me is that I don't hear any policy. I don't hear any hey, this was an act of terrorism, and we're going to charge this kid like a terrorist, and we're going to hold all these groups that terrorize people on Facebook with hate speech and, telling me, I already, we'll see you in an oven, thanks so much. But instead, what you have is Republican legislatures doing very strange things today. In Florida, they're introducing a criminal penalty for protesters who obstruct traffic, and they're exempt. They're going to exempt drivers from liability if they strike a protester with their car. I also saw it in North Dakota. Indiana, the Senate said that they would allow police to shut down highway protests by using, quote, any means necessary. In Tennessee, Republicans want drivers to be protected by from liability if they strike a protester and kill them. I mean, we are off the rails here.
Well, and let's be clear. They all started talking about doing this as a result of Black Lives Matter. So what they're really saying is they want right-wing, racist, pro-police brutality people to be able to ram Black Lives Matter protesters. They certainly, I don't think, would have come up with those ideas if somebody had rammed a bunch of Nazis in their town. I'm not saying that you should ram Nazis. I'm just saying that wasn't the impetus. This is about shutting down, and these are the same people who scream and yell that Milo Yiannopoulos doesn't have enough places to talk, and Ann Coulter doesn't have enough places to talk, and that free speech means you got to give a microphone to everybody with an opinion who wants to come to your campus, and yet if you want to have a demonstration that maybe disrupts traffic for a minute, you get to go to jail and somebody gets to run you over if you're doing that in the name of ending police brutality. So we see when these people talk about free speech, they don't mean that. They don't stand up for the free speech of people of color. Or people on the left. They stand up for free speech only for people who, ironically, if they came to power, would eradicate the concept altogether. And that tells you a lot about where their sympathies lie.
And that's exactly what I see happening in these Republican legislatures. They are really trying to get rid of free speech in the name of free speech. And it's an endless, wild circle of hatred that is, fueling so much of this violence. And the president is kind of, deaf, dumb, and blind to it because he doesn't believe in anything. This is what happens when you have a president that has no moral compass. He has no moral character. He sees, equality between, guys like my dad who would fight fascism till his dying breath and fascists. He thinks they're the same. I mean,
Well, I mean, I agree. I think the lack of principle. I mean, this is the horrible truth of the matter is I can't think of another Republican, for that matter, president who would have treated this the way that he treated this. I don't think for one second George W. Bush, for all of his flaws, would have come up with as mealy-mouthed a statement as what Trump did. I know Reagan wouldn't. Reagan actually, at one point, whether he believed it or not, Reagan said he didn't want the votes of Klansmen because the Klan endorsed him or whatever. And he said,
well, he also started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Right. I mean, he used racism all the time when he ran for office after.
Yeah, it was a little passive aggressive, I have to say.
Yeah, he appealed. He did. He appealed to it, but even he had the courage, even in spite of all of that. Even he had the courage to come out and at least say the word.
Yeah, because his poll numbers were good enough. Donald Trump's poll numbers aren't good enough for him to say, I can live without the 17% of my voters who are, white supremacists.
Because let's be honest, him finally condemning the Klan is not going to get him any additional votes. But I can't wait to see what some of the Nazis say now that he's theoretically thrown them under the bus. I don't think he has, but they'll certainly think that he has.
Oh, they'll tell each other that he had to do it. He had to do it to preserve them.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, this is just an endless thing. I mean, just last week or the week before, when he was talking about police brutality and tweeted out about a transgender ban and dismantling the Civil Rights Division and the whole thing during the campaign with Blue Lives Matter. And meanwhile, you have people in this country who have to watch, racist police officers go free over and over and over again. And there's no policy by the president to make any of this, a little bit better or to make some progress on these issues that have been with us, like you said, since the inception.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, I think an important point you're bringing up, as we focus, as we must, on the fascist forces of white nationalism, let's not take our eye off of this bigger picture because, the reason we get some overt racism, the likes of which we saw in Charlottesville, which luckily is not representative, obviously, of most white folks. It's not representative of the country as a whole, that level of hatred and bigotry. But the reason we get that is because, if you live in a society where we tolerate these profound racial disparities in the justice system, employment, income, housing, wealth, 15-to-1 wealth gaps, 2-to-1 unemployment gaps, 3-to-1 poverty gaps, black folks 3.25 times more likely to be shot while unarmed than white folks. When you tolerate that sends a message to everyone that, in fact, black lives don't matter as much as white lives, that white folks are deserving of more. So in other words, when you tolerate that level of inequality, you're actually feeding the mentality of white entitlement and white supremacy, so that when that then gets challenged, maybe by diversity initiatives at a campus or in a company, these white folks lose their mind because everything has told them that we are better. Everything has told us as white folks, especially white men, that we are the supreme, that we are the ones who run things. So until we deal with the institutional inequity, we're going to continue to send this message to generation after generation of young white folks. If we want to stop what's going on in places like Charlottesville, yeah, we got to deal with them directly, but we also have to take aim at the larger institutional and systemic inequality, which actually feeds racist mentality.
Right. And that's why people may not have understood why, I made such a long and serious effort to expose the senseless deaths of unarmed black men in this country captured on videotape, and followed those trials to the no indictment, to the, hey, you could, we found you not guilty. I mean, this to me was pornography. This to me is profane. This to me is some of the most, I can't look at a naked woman's body, but I can look at, a Philando Castile's girlfriend videotaping his death, where, he did nothing wrong except tell the cop that I'm just like you. I have a concealed carry permit. I'm gonna show it to.
Right.
I mean, that is profanity. That's obscenity. The Supreme Court says they know it when they see it. Well, that was the most pornographic videotape I ever saw in my life. And then nothing happens. And then nothing happens.
Sure.
And so you have a whole bunch of people in this country who know not to expect equality, and that's sad enough. That makes me weep. Honestly, it hurts me so badly inside. But then you have white people who feel guilty about it because they don't know what to do, and so instead of talking, and instead of confronting, and instead of listening, and instead of understanding or getting involved, they might feel some tinge of guilt that they contributed to this mess, and so they shun it. They don't want to talk about it. Well, we need policy.
Meanwhile, the best way to absolve guilt or to relinquish guilt is to take a stand and get busy. If people are feeling guilty about the history of the country, they're not gonna be involved in anyone's liberation. We have to move through guilt and actually get angry about what's being done, particularly when it's done in our name. I mean, these things are being done supposedly. Donald Trump says his policies are to help the forgotten middle class. We know who he's talking about. That's right-wing virtue signaling. He's talking about white folks. So if you've got a guy who says, I'm here just to help you, even if it means at other people's expense, if you don't like that, you have to stand up and say that you don't like that. You have to actually there's no point feeling guilty. Get angry that people, whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's Richard Spencer and Matt Heimbach or whether it's David Duke, are trying to take away your own agency and tell you what it means to be a white person in this country. And the reality is there are lots of ways that white folks can choose to live in this skin. We can choose to be silent and go along, which a lot of people did. A lot of white folks did that under enslavement. Most white Southerners didn't own slaves, but they didn't complain about the ones who did. During segregation, most white Southerners didn't own segregated lunch counters, but by God, they sat at the stools and they ate at them, right? We have to make a decision, not about are we going to be, actively racist. The question is, are we going to be actively anti-racist? Because the idea that we can just sort of sit back, be neutral, post cute pictures of our cats and dogs on Facebook while black folks are talking about people dying, that day is done. And we have to make a decision now, because our ongoing silence gives consent and makes us every bit as culpable as the people who are beating folks in the streets and running them over in Charlottesville.
I agree with you, and I needed you to put it in such an accessible way, because I am angry. I was so angry. I'm almost crying here. I just this entire weekend was so sickening to me, and the lack of hey, we won't tolerate this. We're going to come up with new ideas. I mean, honest to God, I just wish that we had the temerity as a country, as white people in this country, who is still the very, very large majority, to say, insulting a black person or insulting a Jew is now a finable offense. Just something to switch it out, something so that they can, that people will understand what it's like to enjoy this privilege and not do anything with it on behalf of other human beings. It's just so.
Well, I think at the very least, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend fining.
Yes, I want to.
For what they, but I would. I know. The impulse is genuine.
I mean, if you litter in the streets, right, you get a fine.
Right.
Well, I think that if you just like walk up to somebody who's Jewish, or you send them a Facebook message that says, "I can't wait to see you in an oven," I should be able to, call up Facebook and they get fined.
Right. Well, I think at the very least, what we should do is this, and I think we've seen some of this in the wake of Charlottesville. When people engage in overt racism, whether that's in the streets of a city in this country, or whether that's this kind of vitriolic hatred they send around online, if you're going to do that and you're going to put your stuff in the street, as we say in the South, then if I find out who you are, and especially if you're going to march around with your face uncovered, the Klan was smarter. They used to wear masks. These guys are marching. These guys are marching around showing their face. Well, fine. We're going to identify you, and we're going to expose you online. You want to put it in the street, fine. Then we're going to do trash collection. And the trash collection involves making sure folks know who you are. And if your employer is still cool with that, good for you. That's called the marketplace of ideas. If your employer feels, hey, that's great, or you're your own boss, fantastic. If your parents don't mind, fantastic. But the idea, there's free speech, but there's no such thing as consequence-free speech. Just because you have a right to say something doesn't mean it's right to say it, and it certainly doesn't mean that I have to hold my tongue or keep you from suffering any penalty. I certainly am not saying the state should lock you up. That's what free speech is. The state cannot oppress you. But you do not have a right to your job, whatever job that is. You don't have a right to be held in high regard. So if you're going to parade around and be a Nazi, then we're going to make sure folks know you're a Nazi. And, good luck with that.
You know who started that this weekend, and I thought it was really brilliant. But, the reporter, Kurt Eichenwald, somebody sent, he's got epilepsy, and somebody sent him a strobe once, and it caused him to have seizures, and they did it again this weekend. And Kurt Eichenwald decided that he would take the photos from the rally of the fascists and put them on Twitter and ask people to retweet them thousands of times so that their employer would see that this idiot works for you. And now it did work in this weird way. GoDaddy is not going to be the server any longer for the Stormer or whatever. Daily Stormer. Yeah. They told them they had 24 hours, and Anonymous, whoever that is, they took over their website. So, there are things like that. And I've been tweeting at a place called Yes, You're Racist, which also does that. They promote the photos of the people who were caught doing these things, and to let their employers know, to let their schools know, to let their parents know. I mean, this little snot-nose was 20 years old. His mother claimed complete and total ignorance, had no idea, because he had a black friend. What year are we living in? Yeah. Oh, my God.
Yeah, right. Well, George Zimmerman took a black girl to the prom, right? Wasn't that the line that we all heard? It certainly didn't mean very much in the long run. Right. I mean, the thing about it, and I'm not, I don't like to have to shame people, because I know that shame can be a very destructive emotion. But if you're going to have the guts to go out and consort pretty openly with terrorists, then I really don't have any problem making sure everyone knows that's who you are. And so if Andrew Anglin can find or build his own web server for the Daily Stormer, God bless, but you're not going to rely on some other company, you're not going to rely on another company that is run by someone else who hates you and doesn't believe in what you believe in. And that's not censorship. That's called a market decision. If Andrew Anglin doesn't like it, if Richard Spencer doesn't like it, they can build their own computer network. God knows they're a master race. Surely they can figure out how to do that.
I love you. Thank you so much. You were so helpful to me today. Yeah. I would suggest to everybody out there, if you know Tim Wise, you know Tim Wise, and you'll never forget Tim Wise. But if you're just meeting him for the first time today, he has books you need to read. The latest one's called Under the Affluence, and it's shaming the poor, praising the rich, and sacrificing the future of America. But the one I think that is germane today is Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. And White Like Me, it was also a keeper, I have to say, Tim.
Thank you so much.
You're a brilliant guy, and you're a soulful man, and that's why I think you make me cry. So thank you for your heart.
Thank you.
I really appreciate everything.
Bet.
Thank you. And teaching,
You bet. Thank you.
teaching
Take
me
care.
how to speak to white people.
You bet. Good luck with that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Have a great
All right.
day. Okay.
Go to
Bye-bye.
RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.